The legendary saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. The stones of Paris still remember the morning in 845 when hundreds of dragon-headed ships emerged from the mist of the Seine, their oars cutting through the water like knife blades through silk. At their head stood a giant of a man with piercing eyes and a cloak of legends, Ragnar Lothbrok. He had sailed up the impossible river, past every defense Charles the Bald had erected, commanding the most fearsome fleet Western Europe had ever seen. But this was merely the crescendo of a life that reads like a Norse saga come alive. A farmer's son who killed a giant serpent to win a princess's hand, a king who wove ambition and cunning like the threads of a tapestry, and a warrior who would die with a smile on his face in a pit of snakes. His name would echo through centuries, whispered in great halls and around hearthfires, a testament to an age when myth and history danced so closely that none could tell where one ended and the other began. The rise of Ragnar Lothbrok, a Norse saga. The winter of 793 brought an omen that sent shivers through Christian Europe. A great storm of dragons appeared in the northern skies over Northumbria, their serpentine forms wrestling in violent celestial dance. Months later, black-sailed ships emerged from the fog at Lindisfarne Monastery. The Vikings had arrived, and with them, an age of fire and transformation began. But this was no mere explosion of violence. It was the birth of an era that would reshape the map of Europe, birthed by a perfect storm of population pressure, climate change, and technological revolution in shipbuilding. In the north, petty kingdoms clashed and merged like drops of mercury. Denmark, the jewel of the Baltic, stood at the crossroads of this churning world. Here, ambitious chiefs wielded power through a complex web of loyalty, trade, and violence. They commanded longships that could cross open seas yet navigate shallow rivers, crewed by farmers who transformed into warriors each summer. These were the waters that would shape young Ragnar, son of a minor chieftain, into the most feared sea king of his age. The world Ragnar grew into was one of stark contrasts. In the halls of jarls, skalds sang ancient poems while traders brought glittering silk from Baghdad. Christian monks penned warnings of the apocalypse while Norse merchants haggled in the bustling ports of Kiev. And in this world of colliding cultures and ambitions, a new type of leader was needed, one who could bridge the gap between the old ways and the new. Ragnar would become that bridge, though the cost would be written in blood across half a continent. Each summer, more ships pushed south, probing the wealthy kingdoms of England and Francia like wolves testing a herd's defenses. But where others saw only plunder, Ragnar would see opportunity. While rival chiefs fought for gold and glory, he would forge something far more valuable. A reputation that would make kings tremble at the mere mention of his name. The stage was set for a man who could unite the fractious Norse world and turn their fierce independence into an unstoppable force. That man would need the cunning of Odin, the strength of Thor, and luck that even the gods would envy. Ragnar Lothbrok would prove to be all this and more. The rise of Ragnar Lothbrok, from legend to empire builder. Few tales capture the essence of Viking mythology, quite like young Ragnar's battle with the giant serpent. The story goes that Herod, a powerful jarl of Götaland, had a problem. A massive snake, given as a curiosity to his daughter Thora, had grown into a monster that encircled her bower, threatening any who dared approach. The jarl promised his daughter's hand to anyone who could slay the beast. Where seasoned warriors failed, a young farmer's son arrived with nothing but a set of boiled leather breeches and a spear. That boy was Ragnar. In the frosty dawn, he plunged his clothes into the freezing marsh, letting the mud cake thick upon the leather. As the serpent struck, its fangs caught helplessly in the frozen mud of his makeshift armor. Ragnar drove his spear up through the beast's throat, earning both his famous nickname Lothbrok, Shaggy Breeches, and the hand of Princess Thora. But fate has a way of weaving complex patterns. Thora would die young, leaving Ragnar with 2 sons and a burning ambition that would drive him to the edges of the known world. By his 20th summer, Ragnar had already led his first raid, striking deep into Frisia with a fleet of 5 ships. He showed an uncanny talent for picking vulnerable targets and timing his attacks with the precision of a master chess player. Other young raiders might have been content with plunder, but Ragnar played a longer game. Each raid built not just his wealth, but his reputation. He cultivated an aura of invincibility, spreading stories of his own exploits that grew with each retelling. In an age where fame was currency, Ragnar became rich indeed. Then came the meeting that would change everything, a shield maiden named Lagertha. The sagas say she fought like a Valkyrie with a fierce intelligence that matched Ragnar's own. Their marriage would forge more than a union. It created a partnership that would shake the foundations of Francia itself. She bore him 3 children and commanded his left flank in battle, her presence alone worth 100 warriors. Together, they began building something unprecedented, not just a war band, but the beginnings of an empire. But even these triumphs were merely prologue. The name Ragnar Lothbrok was about to echo across Europe, carried on winds of change that would reshape the very world itself. The Snake Slayer was becoming something far more dangerous, a man with the power to make history bend to his will. The Sea King's ambition, Ragnar's naval revolution. In the sheltered fjords of Denmark, Ragnar unleashed a revolution in naval warfare. While other chiefs built their ships for coastal raiding, he envisioned vessels that could cross the storm-racked North Sea and still navigate the shallowest river. His longships emerged from the shipyards like sea dragons, longer, lighter, and deadlier than anything seen before. The keel of his flagship, carved from a single massive oak, measured over 70 feet. When its sail caught the wind, it could outrun any pursuing vessel. When the wind failed, 60 oars could drive it up the narrowest waterway. These weren't just ships, they were the keys to an empire. The English learned of Ragnar's innovation the hard way. Their coastal watchmen, accustomed to Vikings hugging the shoreline, were stunned when Ragnar's fleet appeared from the open ocean, striking deep into East Anglia with devastating precision. His crews moved like ghosts, appearing and vanishing before local forces could mobilize. But unlike other raiders who grabbed whatever they could carry, Ragnar studied his targets. He noted defenses, catalogued weaknesses, and most importantly, gathered intelligence about the political rivalries that divided the English kingdoms. Each raid served 2 purposes: immediate plunder and long-term strategic advantage. Then came Aslaug. The sagas say she appeared before him like a Valkyrie made flesh, a princess with the gift of prophecy who could match his cunning with her own. Their meeting marked a turning point. Lagertha, sensing the shift in Ragnar's affections, left to forge her own legend. But Aslaug brought something crucial to Ragnar's ambitions: legitimacy. Through her claimed lineage to legendary heroes, she helped transform Ragnar from a brilliant raider into something more: a king whose authority was woven from both might and myth. Their sons would carry names heavy with destiny: Ivar the Boneless, Björn Ironside, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Ubba, each destined to eclipse their father's fame in their own ways. From his base in Denmark, Ragnar now commanded a network of alliances and tributaries stretching from Norway to the Baltic. His fleet had grown from 5 ships to hundreds. But for Ragnar, this was still just the beginning. His gaze turned south, toward the glittering prize that had tempted Vikings for generations: the fabled walls of Paris. The Seine River would soon feel the weight of dragon-headed prows, and the Franks would learn to fear the name Lothbrok. The rise and reign of Ragnar, architect of the North. Denmark under Ragnar's rule became a spider's web of power, with every strand trembling at his touch. From his seat at Liege, he orchestrated a political revolution as cunning as his military campaigns. Other Viking chiefs ruled through brute force alone. Ragnar built a network of loyal jarls bound by marriage, mutual profit, and carefully cultivated fear. Each raid's spoils were distributed with calculated precision, enough to keep his allies hungry for more, but never enough to make them independent of his favor. When rivals emerged, they had an uncanny habit of encountering misfortune, shipwrecks in calm seas, fires in their great halls, or sudden illness after feasting at Ragnar's table. The Frankish Empire discovered the full measure of his cunning in 845. Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, had built a system of fortified bridges and garrisons along the Seine to trap Viking raiders. Ragnar simply went around them. He landed his fleet on the coast during winter, a season when Vikings were expected to be home, and portaged his ships overland, bypassing the entire defensive network. The Franks awoke to find Norse dragons sailing upriver toward Paris, their oars cutting through morning mist like skeletal fingers. What followed was not mere raiding, but a masterclass in psychological warfare. Ragnar executed prisoners in spectacular fashion, displayed his forces in complex maneuvers that hinted at far greater numbers, and sent envoys with demands that mixed outrageous arrogance with unsettling intelligence about Frankish weaknesses. Behind the scenes, a more subtle game unfolded. Every raid gathered not just plunder but information, maps, diplomatic secrets, and details about noble feuds that could be exploited. Ragnar's network of traders, who moved freely through Christian lands, brought back more than just goods. They carried messages, bribes, and threats to key officials. Some Frankish nobles began secretly cooperating with the Vikings, seeing them as useful allies in their own power struggles. Ragnar didn't just break the Frankish defenses, he turned them into Swiss cheese through corruption and fear. Yet success bred new challenges. Other Viking chiefs, drawn by tales of Ragnar's victories, began launching their own raids into Francia. Rather than fight them, Ragnar positioned himself as first among equals, coordinating their efforts into a greater strategy. He became not just a king, but a force of nature, the architect of a new order in the north. The Franks called him the Scourge of God. His own people whispered that he was blessed by Odin himself. But like all who soar too close to the sun, Ragnar was about to learn that the gods have a cruel sense of humor, and destiny's favorite joke is to grant ambitions in the most painful way possible. The rise of the Great Heathen Army. History pivots on moments that seem insignificant at first glance. For Ragnar, it was the birth of his son Ivar. The child emerged with legs that seemed twisted like branches, yet possessed a mind sharp as a newly forged sword. While other Vikings might have exposed such a child, Ragnar saw something of himself in Ivar's calculating eyes. He raised the boy not as a warrior, but as something more dangerous, a strategist. Ivar learned to compensate for his disability by developing an almost supernatural gift for military planning. His brothers, each fearsome in their own right, deferred to his tactical genius. Björn Ironside inherited his father's gift for naval warfare, Sigurd's snake in the eye his diplomatic cunning, and Ubbi his talent for leadership. Together, they would transform their father's dream into a nightmare for Christian Europe. The Great Heathen Army that assembled under Ragnar's banner in 865 was unlike anything Europe had seen before. Previous Viking raids were summer adventures. This was a professional fighting force built for conquest. Ivar introduced innovations that would revolutionize warfare. A corps of full-time warriors trained in Roman tactics, siege engines that could be assembled on site, and a revolutionary system of supply lines maintained by allied merchants. The army moved like a living thing, splitting and recombining as needed, striking simultaneously at multiple targets. English chronicles describe it as a dragon with many heads, each bite delivering poison to the heart of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. But the army's true power lay in its intelligence network. Years of raiding had created a web of informants, sympathizers, and double agents throughout England. Monasteries, those supposed sanctuaries of Christian learning, often served as unwitting intelligence outposts for the Vikings. Monks, hoping to preserve their libraries, provided detailed information about local defenses and politics. The Great Army didn't just attack targets. It appeared precisely where and when kingdoms were most vulnerable, exploiting regional rivalries with surgical precision. The transformation was complete. Ragnar had evolved from raid leader to military revolutionary. His army wasn't just a tool for plunder, it was the sword arm of a new empire emerging from the northern mists. Each victory swelled their ranks as opportunists and mercenaries flocked to the winning side. English kings found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to read their minds, anticipate their moves, and strike at their weakest points. Even more terrifying was the knowledge that this was just the beginning. The Great Army was the prototype for a new kind of warfare that would reshape medieval Europe. Yet fate, ever the cruel playwright, was preparing a final act that would transform triumph into tragedy and victory into vengeance. Ragnar's Siege of Paris, a legendary conquest. Paris in 845 was a glittering jewel in the crown of Francia, its walls bristling with defensive towers, its bridges fortified with iron chains that could trap unwary ships. Charles the Bald had spent a fortune making the city impregnable to Viking assault. But he hadn't counted on Ragnar's flair for the impossible. The Viking king arrived not just with warriors, but with a theatrical sense of timing that would have made the Roman emperors envious. His fleet materialized through the morning mist like a nightmare, 120 ships carrying over 4,000 warriors, their dragon heads looming over the river like gods passing judgment. The siege that followed wasn't just warfare, it was psychological opera. Ragnar had his berserkers perform elaborate ritual combats on the riverbank, their howls echoing off the city walls. His men launched severed heads from catapults, each one belonging to a captured noble who had refused to pay ransom. At night, hundreds of torches would appear on the hills around Paris, suggesting an army far larger than reality. When a party of Frank nobles came to negotiate, Ragnar received them seated on a throne built from captured Christian reliquaries, drinking wine from a gilded chalice stolen from the Abbey of Saint-Germain. The message was clear: the barbarian had become the emperor. But the true masterstroke came from Ragnar's deep understanding of Frankish politics. He didn't just attack Paris, he compromised it from within. Weeks before the siege, his agents had spread gold and promises among the city's merchants, who now faced a choice: resist and lose everything, or cooperate and profit from the new order. When Charles finally agreed to pay an enormous ransom, many suspected the negotiations had been choreographed in advance. Ragnar sailed away with 7,000 pounds of silver and gold, but the real prize was intangible. He had demonstrated that no city, no matter how well defended, was beyond his reach. The Paris raid marked the apex of Ragnar's career, the moment when myth and man aligned perfectly. He had evolved from a simple raider into something unprecedented, a Viking king who could make emperors tremble with mere threats. But success at this scale breeds special kinds of enemies. As Ragnar sailed home in triumph, darker forces were already in motion. King Aella of Northumbria had been watching, learning, and planning. He understood something crucial about legends. They're most powerful when they end in tragedy. And he was preparing a very special kind of tragedy indeed, one involving a pit full of snakes. Ragnar's final campaign, the legend's end. The irony would not have been lost on Ragnar. The man who began his legend by slaying a serpent would end it in a pit of them. His final campaign to Northumbria in 865 seemed cursed from the start. Storms scattered his fleet. Fog led his remaining ships onto treacherous shoals. By the time he landed, he commanded only 2 ships instead of 20. A younger Ragnar might have retreated, but age and legend had made him bold. Perhaps too bold. King Aella had studied the great Vikings' tactics for years, learning to think like his enemy. When Ragnar struck inland, he found not helpless monasteries but empty lands. A trap was closing. Aella's masterstroke was devastating in its simplicity. He didn't try to defeat Ragnar's warriors in open battle. He isolated them, cut their supply lines, and let the harsh English winter do his work. One by one, Ragnar's men succumbed to cold, hunger, and carefully planned ambushes. When the final battle came, it was almost anticlimactic. The legendary king was captured not by heroic combat, but by exhaustion and numbers. Aella had achieved what no other ruler had managed. He had forced Ragnar to fight on someone else's terms. The snake pit itself was a stroke of dark genius, a death designed not just to kill, but to resonate. As Ragnar was led to the edge, witnesses say he didn't struggle or beg. Instead, he laughed, delivering words that would echo through centuries. How the little pigs would grunt if they knew the fate of the old boar. Even in death, he was playing the long game. He knew his sons would hear of this, and that they would respond with a vengeance that would shake England to its foundations. The snakes did their work slowly, their venom turning the greatest Viking of his age into a legend. Ragnar died as he had lived, transforming defeat into a kind of victory. His death would unleash forces far greater than anything he had commanded in life. His sons would return with the Great Heathen Army, subjecting Aella to the Blood Eagle, a death so horrific that chroniclers refuse to describe it in detail. Northumbria would fall, then East Anglia, then Mercia. The Wolf's Head ships would sail up every river in England, and the gods of the north would feast on the souls of kings. Ragnar's final laugh in the snake pit wasn't just defiance, it was prophecy. He had engineered his own apotheosis, ensuring that his name would live forever in the sagas. In death, as in life, he had played the game of kings and legends to the very end. The eternal legacy of Ragnar Lothbrok. Medieval England told ghost stories about Ragnar's sons. Ivar the Boneless, they said, couldn't be killed by normal weapons. Björn Ironside's fleet became so vast it could block out the sun. Sigurd's snake in the eye's gaze could freeze men in their tracks. These weren't just tales. They were the echoes of a political earthquake that reshaped medieval Europe. The Great Heathen Army, forged in the crucible of their father's death, didn't just raid England, they colonized it. The Danelaw, that great swath of England where Viking law held sway, wasn't just conquered territory. It was Ragnar's last laugh, a cultural fusion that would eventually transform English society itself. The ripples spread far beyond Britain's shores. Björn led fleets into the Mediterranean, raiding as far as Italy. Ivar's descendants would rule Dublin for generations. Sigurd's line would wear the crown of Denmark. Each branch of Ragnar's family tree grew into a dynasty of its own, their blood flowing through the veins of medieval Europe's most powerful rulers. But perhaps their father's greatest legacy was subtler. They had proven that the barbarians could build kingdoms as sophisticated as any in Christendom. The Vikings who came after Ragnar weren't just raiders. They were empire builders, traders, and legislators who would help birth the medieval world. Ragnar's story refuses to die. Each age reinvents him. The Victorians made him a noble savage. Modern films cast him as a prototypical revolutionary. He endures because he embodied something timeless, the outsider who changes the world through sheer force of will. In an age of satellites and smartphones, we still tell tales of the farmer's son who slew a serpent, outthought emperors, and laughed in the face of death. Perhaps that's the real measure of his achievement. Ragnar Lothbrok didn't just want to rule his world, he wanted to be remembered. In that, at least, his victory was total and eternal. The stone walls of Paris still stand. The English language still bears the marks of Norse influence. And somewhere in the human imagination, dragon-headed ships still emerge from the morning mist, carrying dreams of glory and revolution. Ragnar's greatest conquest wasn't of land or gold, it was of memory itself. In the end, isn't that what every great life aspires to? Not just to live, but to become legend. By that measure, the man who died in a snake pit achieved something close to immortality. The little pigs still grunt, and the old boar still makes kings tremble in their dreams.